Hey, I am Paula McMillan-Perez, as you can see on the slide. I am a licensed clinical social worker, psychotherapist, mental health systems and workflow strategist, and host of the Why Don't We Talk About This podcast. I recognize that the IEP process can feel very overwhelming. And as somebody who has worked in schools for about a decade, I'm just now getting to the point where I can explain it better. So I can only imagine how folks who don't know how this process works or might just be getting started in this process may feel a little bit overwhelmed by all of the moving pieces. So the goal today is to kind of like demystify some of that and go through what the flow of the process looks like. And I will acknowledge it is a lot of information. So I just make the suggestion to just take a couple of notes, or if there are things that as we're going through it, you have questions about, definitely jot those down because as I go through the presentation and I give some more examples, you may find that those questions get answered. But if not, definitely feel free to bring any scenarios or situations that have either come up in your professional space, or if you are a provider or person who is navigating the process for yourself, advocating for a family, or work in some other capacity where it may be helpful to know this information, then you definitely are going to want to like bring some things up. So let's get this ball rolling on this Taco Tuesday. Okay, so one of the questions that is a really good intro to ask, and some of these questions that you'll see here and moving forward are questions that I also ask parents, families, stakeholders, because it's really good to be able to get the frame, the reflection in to kind of like anchor what we're trying to achieve here. So, like, are you wondering if your child is getting the support they need in school? Whether that is because you see something, you hear something, you know your child, you are hearing from maybe another provider, somebody in your family that works in special education or mental health, and some of what you're seeing and hearing doesn't connect, and you're wondering, like, what's coming up there? This could be a good question to ask yourself. And also, as you're kind of dipping your toe into like the special education space, do you feel overwhelmed trying to understand what special education services are available? Now, we may know our child best and not negating that to any parent, but what it looks like in the special education or pedagogical lens may look a little bit different. So it's really important to kind of get a sense of what is available. And even if you don't know what each service is or what it means, to definitely ask questions, or even just asking flat out, what are the services that this school has available? Because just because there's a special education service that's available within the state of New York, or if you're outside of New York watching this, based on what state you're in, this all comes from the federal level. So there's a sprinkling, granted, everybody needs more funding, but there's a sprinkling everywhere, but it may be due to lack of providers or lack of access that maybe a service isn't available in your school for one reason or another. So just start by getting the list down. That could help. And yeah, it's okay to feel overwhelmed because this is a lot. It was overwhelming for me, but as part of my role, I had to learn it. Next slide, please. So you're not alone. Every parent, every stakeholder, teacher, educator, AP principal, they want their child, they want their students to thrive. They want them to succeed. They want them to make academic gains regardless to what rather their ability level is. So sometimes that means getting extra help. And if we think about this from the equity lens, we need to make sure that we are doing our best to give everyone what they need to be successful. We have different learners, we have different learning styles, we have different modalities that can reach people in different ways. But unless we know what is needed, we're not going to be able to provide that additional support, scaffolding, intervention to make sure that the equity is built into the systems. So one of my goals for this presentation is to kind of give you an overview and hopefully utilize some examples that can make what tends to feel like overwhelming information a little bit more bite-sized chunks and, excuse me, and realistic. So we're going to go through things like things to consider in the process when we have multilingual learners, because we know that if our home language is different than the language that we're being taught in, there is some gaps there. And through no fault of anyone's, through no fault of anyone, but language like it's not an easy thing to learn. Kids do it all the time. This is when we want to get them, when they're sponges, where they could observe things, but that doesn't necessarily mean that we can't build scaffolds in. Eligibility, to identify who is eligible for special education services. What does that look like? At talking to teachers and care providers, extracting information, not just things that can help you identify, is this a process that may be worthwhile to go into for your child? Or as you're going through the process, or after you've completed the process and you might be doing a reevaluation or different needs come up, these are the people that are working best with the child so they can provide the information that's necessary. Also, what questions to ask? Many parents, and even sometimes depending on the advocacy person that may be coming with them, especially if they're not a special education advocate, they're not necessarily sure what questions to ask because the process is so broad. And then what is response to intervention? To be perfectly honest with you, I didn't know that that's what the title was. I know what it consists of, working in a school, because I was one of the individuals that supported it, but I didn't know it had a name for a while. What are 504 accommodations and how do they differ from IEPs? Some folks start with that to see if is this an intervention that can be a step in the right direction, because we also don't want to place more restriction on a child if it's not needed, and I'll go into that. And then if we want to just dip our toe a little further, maybe put in the whole foot or maybe up to the knee, how do we make a referral to begin to get the ball rolling to identify, you know what? Is this child, youth, however you client, you frame them, going to get what they need in terms of the process? And then the whole evaluation process from start to finish. And then once it is determined that a student maybe has a level of need, what that IEP process looks like. So we're going to just kind of run the gamut. Next slide, please. Okay, so some things to consider. So you may think that your child or your client might benefit from special education services. So we want to keep a few things in mind. Children, youth, again, clients, however you want to call them, they learn and develop in different speeds and different ways. It can be environmental factors, socioeconomic factors that impact this as so much as learning differences, developmental needs, everything plays a role. So one of the things to note is that just because your child learns differently or not in the traditional sense doesn't necessarily mean that they have a disability. Sometimes we just need more time. Like even my husband, he didn't talk right away as a child and his mother was concerned. She brought him to the doctor, had a full-on conversation with the doctor. He just didn't want to talk. Like he didn't feel like he had anything to say. And if that's happening to a young child, you can only imagine when different things are introduced, different situations are being presented in the classroom. If it's overwhelming, there could be a bunch of different things going on that don't necessarily necessitate that a child has a disability. So one of the things that we also want to highlight, and I'm not going to lie, I want to heavily emphasize this, is that children shouldn't be referred for special education services because of limited English proficiency. Limited English proficiency. We are going through a time in our city right now where we do have a lot of migrant families coming from a variety of different countries. They're English language learners. And English, as those of us who do speak other languages, I do not, know English can be a very challenging language to learn. But just because you have limited English proficiency does not mean you have a disability, does not mean that you are struggling to understand or comprehend. The information needs to be presented, hopefully in your home language, or have scaffolds to identify as such so that you can get what you need. And as a result, English language learner services are provided. I would love to see more of them in schools, especially with the influx that we have now, because prior to the amount of migrants we've had come to New York City, I personally didn't feel that they were sufficient, but there are other reasons for that. Next slide, please. So multilingual learners. This is basically if English isn't your child's first language. They could be speaking Spanish at home, Farsi, Korean. These are the languages that are spoken in the home based on the parents' heritage and culture. So if you speak a language different than if your child or your youth speak a language different than English. So I'm just going to say that, different than English. Like English is not their home first language, and that's not what they speak to their parents, grandparents, whoever. They're entitled to additional support, point blank, period. So ENL or ELL, previously known as ESL, depending on how old we are. I'm telling on myself a little bit. There are programs in schools. to support individuals who are learning English as an additional, not necessarily second, because some of these kids know more languages than a little bit, but programs that are designed with teachers, pullouts, interventions to support them. Then we also have bilingual programs. So bilingual in English, Spanish, as an example, which is really popular. Some dual language programs. So even if it's not Spanish, it could be French, it could be something else, because we're learning two languages at the same time, or maybe even becoming more proficient in a language because there are multiples. And also when we're learning language, having a command of grammar, having a grasp of continuity, all of these things are really important. And then if we have deaf or hard of hearing children, sign language interpretation services may also be available. There are also specialized schools for individuals that have this level of need, not just because they will be immersed in an environment that is aligned with their educational needs, but also for social and emotional reasons as well. And just to make sure that the carved out supports are targeted for the audience, are targeted for the type of learner. So if those of you who are aware of your learning style, hopefully you weren't like me and learned what your best learning style was in grad school, this is one of the ways that you can learn what is best to support you where you are. So if you are a multilingual learner, one of these supports may be for you. Next slide, please. So eligibility. So if your child or your youth is demonstrating either delays or deficiencies, I prefer the term lagging skills because we don't necessarily know what it is. We don't want to name it before we're able to assess. In one of these following areas, that could help them help them meet the criteria for eligibility to move on to the next step. If they do not meet the criteria for at least one of these areas, then they may not meet eligibility, and it may be challenging to be able to obtain approval to go through the process. So thinking and learning. So if, let's say, in comparison, and though we do not like to compare students, we do need to take into consideration the data points of where children should be in terms of educational milestones. So if their thought process or the way they're able to synthesize information falls within a certain range, then that could be indicative of an issue that may warrant some further exploration. If their level of understanding and comprehension or their ability to use language is delayed, so if they are in a space where, and I may butcher this, so I apologize, at maybe 1 or 2 years old, children are supposed to understand or learn or know a certain number of words. So let's say if they're supposed to know 20, that doesn't necessarily mean they're not going to know nothing if they know 10 or 15. But if maybe they know 5 or 6, that may be indicative that something deeper is going on that may warrant a second look. So self-help skills. So basic, our daily living, as we refer to it with adults. So students need to be potty trained when they start school. There are situations for a variety of needs where that is not the norm, and they may be enrolled in a specialized school that can handle those needs. But for the most part, that's one of the main ones. Being able to eat lunch, eat breakfast unassisted. Granted, our littles may be a little messy, but they do have the ability to feed themselves. Getting dressed, putting on a hoodie, putting on a backpack, even if they're not able to tie their shoes just yet, that they know their maybe right and left foot, or at the very least know that their shoes go on their feet. So these basic skills, sometimes our youth do not have those abilities. So that may be something that may warrant additional assessment. So behavior, ability to get along with others, engage in a group, follow directions, that can be really challenging. And it's one of the benefits too of programs like 3K and pre-K, because it helps them not just engage social and emotionally, but prepare themselves for the routine of school, because it becomes a little bit more predictable. It is always something that I hear kindergarten teachers say, when they know which students were involved in the 3K and pre-K programs and those who just came into kindergarten from being home, it's always very easy to tell for a variety of different reasons. Their ability to engage socially with large groups, their ability to follow directions, their ability to self-regulate. Now, these are things that students may be able to do even if they didn't attend these programs, but it can also be indicative that there's a reason for additional assessment if they're having continued struggles. So not just the transitional piece for when school starts in September, if they're still struggling with things that they were struggling with in September and December, that may be a cue that there's a little something else going on that we may want to take a look at. And then physical abilities. So sometimes we have struggles with vision. I wear glasses. I didn't figure out that I needed glasses until I was in the third grade. Hearing may benefit from some other interventions like a hearing aid or there's another term, amplifier, because some people don't need necessarily a hearing aid, they just need to amplify the sound. Movement, their ability to be aware of their body, their limbs, their limitations, that is a struggle for some students depending on what their needs are. So these are all examples of what some eligibility criteria could be for special education services. So if your youth or your child you feel like may fall into this, it is worth trying to explore it. Because one of the things too is, let's say for the sake of argument, you're having this gut feeling, you want to get it checked out, and then you initiate the process and it's come to find out that, you know what, they don't find anything. Okay, that doesn't necessarily mean you take no for an answer, but it should definitely mean that, okay, what are some things that were presented here that maybe I didn't get right, or maybe I didn't get enough information, or maybe I'm just going to try again with a different set of people. Never accept no for an answer. You can tell them I said that because I say that all the time. Next slide. Okay, so this one is really, really important. And I encourage you to take a screenshot of this slide so that you can remember some of these questions because they can be really impactful. Talk to your child's teachers and care providers. Many parents really struggle with what questions to ask. And then let's be real, some of them also struggle with the fact that their child may have extra or additional needs. Nobody wants to jump for joy if their child isn't meeting milestones, or they're not throwing a party if maybe their earlier children, you know, thrived in some ways and then their current child isn't in the same ways. And we generally, for the most part, to my understanding, do not want to compare our children, but lived experience a lot of times puts a level of activation in parents. It's something that I see with my therapy clients, and it's also something that I see with the school staff that I work with. So something that can be really helpful is obtaining as much information as possible about what your teachers or care providers are seeing about your child's abilities and interactions, learning about how your child is doing, how they're engaging with peers, how they're engaging with adults, how they're engaging with the work. And then you can turnkey that and offer them some information about how your child is functioning at home. Because if I had $1 for every time a parent said to a teacher, oh, but they don't do that at home, I would be a millionaire and I wouldn't be sitting here with you. Because for a variety of different reasons, children manifest different ways and different parts of themselves, show their different personalities when they're in school. It's a completely different entity to home. So it is not uncommon for them to show different sides. The same way when I was working in schools, the students that I saw for counseling, especially in small group counseling, they would be completely different kids in our counseling session than they were in classrooms at times. And then when I would do classroom interventions or push in or do or observations even, sometimes I would be like, oh, so this is what the teacher was talking about, because those weren't things that I saw in my spaces. So it's really important for us to kind of get a sense of how do they show up in different places and spaces and share that information with each other, because there can be overlapping information that allows you to kind of extract and extrapolate like what's going on so that you can get a clearer picture. So some of the questions that I want you to think about or can help you gauge the best information are what brings out the best in your child. We want to come at this from a strengths perspective. Hello, social work. We want to kind of gauge the parent or the teacher's ability to identify those pieces. What are your child's strengths and challenges and interests? So those kind of go, they overlap. But it could also be that you're seeing different things at home. So this is definitely one of the things you're going to want to hear from the teacher, because maybe this could be something you turnkey and mimic at home. What does your child like to do outside of school? I also try to ask in free time, depending on the age of the child, because you can get an IEP or rather start the special education process for your child at any time. I worked with a high school student that literally got their IEP their senior year. And even though they don't necessarily honor IEPs in college, you can get special services accommodations if you access the Office of Disability Services or whatever the named counterpart is in the specific school. And having any recent IEP, whether it was a year or 2 years, can kind of give them a framework, especially if you're not accustomed to utilizing the specific language necessary to identify like what worked well for you. And that could assist with you matching up with the accommodations that the school has available to offer based on your learning needs. So what do you do at home to encourage positive behavior and learning? This is a question that parents struggle with. So this one you may want to break down a little bit and provide specific examples to get their gears turning, to kind of like extrapolate a few examples, because it doesn't, and I won't say it doesn't translate well, but it's not something that, you know, with the day-to-day and the expertise, not expertise, I'm sorry. The day-to-day interactions that parents have with their kids, they're not always thinking about it in these terms. So you want to sometimes break things down as like clear and basic as possible and provide examples or prompts to kind of help get it going. And also, what areas does your child need extra help with? So think about that from the perspective of maybe times where they may do things independently versus not. They may show hesitation, they may show avoidance, and how that contrasts with maybe other things that they engage in. That can also help gauge and paint a picture. Next slide, please. Feel free to screenshot this as well. These are some additional questions to help you get more in depth as you are in the information gathering stage. Strengths and challenges in the classroom, or if you want to be more strengths-based, strengths and areas in need of improvement in the classroom. And that can be anywhere from academic to socially, emotionally as well. How do you support my child when they need help? So sometimes people feel like, oh, this is a call out question. But some teachers, providers have specific strategies based on the behaviors that they're seeing. So that also could be really helpful, because then that can allow the parent, especially if it's something that's working well or they're seeing some consistency built up in the classroom, that's something that possibly the parent can mimic at home, which is all the more better for the youth, because that wraparound support, it creates consistency and it creates reinforcement of the expectation or of the behavior, and it better enables them to know like what standard they're being held to and how they're being supported in different places and spaces. Do you have examples of my child's work that we can look at together? This is really helpful because the teacher or provider can break down specific things that they're seeing in their expertise that maybe you wouldn't thought of, or maybe you minimized or overlooked, not from a negative standpoint, but just looking at it from the perspective of, oh, they're learning, they're getting it together. And that very well may be the case, but you may be able to get additional insight or feedback from the provider or the educator on the sample of work that you're taking a look at. Is my child learning and developing at a rate that is expected for their age? This is going to go back to the data of where children should be performing. Now, many teachers who, especially the ones that are very passionate about their role, they will be honest with you with regard to where your child is performing in contrast to where maybe children are performing with respect to grade level. Now, the reason that I say that is because sometimes grade level expectations can be rigorous depending on where you live, depending on access, depending on curriculum. We know that students start standardized testing in 3rd grade. I still remember my 3rd grade experience, stressed out, had test anxiety my whole life. But these are things that we are going to have to learn how to navigate. So it can be really helpful to also understand the data. So one of the questions that can be like a follow-up to this one is, what is the rate? Like, how does that get determined? That's a question that a lot of parents understand and don't necessarily grasp at the same time, because many, especially ones that have gone to school here or had a formalized, standardized education, even if they went to school in other countries, they're also leaning rather on their lived experience. So school has changed a lot. I'm 42. I was a product of New York City public schools. So working in them, it's like, oh, there are some things that are same and there are some things that are different. And there are reasons that they're different. Sometimes we don't want to do the research to find them out, and that's okay. But it can be really helpful to kind of like gauge what like the standard is. And are there caveats? Are there scaffolds? Are there alternative assessments and the reasons why, because you kind of want to get a sense of where your child could fall and also what is important. Like we want them to learn, but what is the overall goal? Because parents, teachers, stakeholders, sometimes they do have different goals, and we may have to kind of like go in and out depending on what's happening. How does my child get along with other students in the classroom? Not just trying to gauge for conflict, but trying to gauge communication, trying to gauge, empathy, trying to gauge ability to recognize emotions in others, especially peers, or maybe react appropriately. So just kind of getting a sense on their level of interaction or maybe capacity to interact can be really helpful. Are there programs in the community that might help my child? There are plenty of parents who are willing to identify if there's community-based supports that are available that can be a supplement to what is happening in the school. And this is regardless to whether or not you decide that you want to engage in the special education process, because there's nothing wrong with additional support. You want a team. We do this as a village. Like they say, it takes a village, a community, a collaboration, whatever you want to call it. There are things that are available to help. Sometimes you just need to find them. What are some learning activities I can do at home or in the neighborhood? Teachers always have resources, whether they are apps, websites, books, other materials. We think about the summer slide, which is pretty much where, students do lose academic abilities over the summer, because if it's one of those, if you don't use it, you lose it. Now you don't lose it completely, but there is a slide back. So thinking about the F&P, the Fontes and Pinnell, I may be saying it wrong. I'm just so used to it being called FMP. That is something that within the first, I'd say, month of school, teachers do because they want to get a sense of where a student's reading level is. For a variety of different reasons, but it's an assessment to get a sense of where they are and what they need. Most of the time, when that FMP does happen, there is reading loss, especially if there isn't consistent efforts being made in the summer to keep it up. So you've heard, children should be reading at least 30 minutes a night. That should still be happening in the summer. But if you're old school and like you come from like maybe a time like, when I was coming up, when it was summer, we broke. Like we didn't want to look at no books, we didn't want to do no math. But the realism is that the data does show that there is learning loss over the summer. So to reduce the summer slide, do a little bit, whether it's once or twice a week, that can be a thing. So when you're asking your teachers for learning activities, workbooks, sheets, programs that you can do at home, that could also be something that happens continuously over the year, so your student also knows to expect it. What are some questions I can ask my child when we read together? So this can be really helpful because you want to support them in their ability to comprehend and confirm comprehension with those questions, or even with critical thinking questions. And it can be just one or two, especially things that they can replicate because they know that you're going to ask. Or maybe they're doing the reading and you're asking the question, or vice versa. You can kind of switch it up. Unfortunately, there are a lot of littles that they don't find reading fun. So we can identify as part of the reason they don't find reading fun because they're struggling, or maybe we haven't been able to kind of gauge what is their genre of books that they like, because that is a big part of it. Even graphic novels, thank God, has seen a surge in schools, and it gives kids the opportunity to get excited about reading again because they also get to view the graphics, and then they get more accustomed to the language. So it's a little bit easier to transition into books that either don't have photos or just have an engaging story and builds on their visualization skills. How can I help my child if they are struggling with homework? I would love to have the answer to this question because I hated some homework in school. But there are ways that we can break it down, strategies that we can utilize. And this was a great question for classroom teachers or subject teachers because they have a sense of how the child is functioning in the classroom when they do work. So it's pretty much just doing it at home. And even though a lot of schools have moved away from providing homework, or they will assign whatever wasn't finished in class to be done at home, it can be really impactful to kind of get a sense of like, what are the strategies that the teacher might be utilizing in the classroom that I can turn to here, or if there are specific things that are more conducive to home or more conducive to the environment. Because like, let's say for the sake of argument, you have a student that is in a classroom that the kids are quiet. They do what they need to do. They buckle down when it's time to, get things done. But you live in a home where they have multiple siblings or you have people coming in and out. So noise is a factor that they kind of struggle with because that's not something that they deal with in school. Could be time of day. Maybe at the end of the day, based on their needs, they're feeling a little bit more tired or a little less focused. The time that we do complete work during the day, especially for youth, does play a role in their ability to persevere through things that are difficult. And then there are some people that just don't do homework for a variety of different reasons. So getting some strategies and some tips and tricks about what the teacher might recommend, or even some other educators that you may know in your space that work in this capacity, can also be helpful. Next slide. So response to intervention, this is an approach that basically is utilized to match individual students. So we're not doing like cohorts or groupings with the teaching practices as well as the level of supports that work best for them. So at this point, we're noticing that something's quite happening, but we're not 100% sure what it is, but we want to try something a little bit different to see if that little bit of difference makes a difference with the youth. So you can still, this is not saying one over the other, you can still make a referral for special education evaluation at any time, regardless to whether you haven't started RTI, you just learned about it, you want to get that going. But the thing about it is that in public school, so like our PS, whatever, if you're in kindergarten to fifth grade, RTI has to be implemented before making a referral. So your school's an AP of special education or IEP coordinator, whoever does SPED services there, will for the most part tell you, okay, that's great that you want to do that. However, this is the first step. So when they're talking about the first step, that's going to be RTI, and they're going to break down what that looks like or what it could look like for your child. And then in tandem with that, we'll be doing something similar to what I'm doing now, is explaining what the process looks like for evaluation for special education as the next step, but we have to go in sequential order. Next slide, please. So the basics of how it works, it's 3 tiers. There's a lot of things in schools that are tiers, so this may be familiar terminology to you. So tier 1, that's everybody. Everybody gets the same thing. They get the quality, they get the quantity, well, depending on where you are, and how it's funded, but they do get differentiated instruction to make sure that based on the needs of the whole group, the teacher is doing their best to identify what are the strategies that work in the classroom setting. So in the classroom setting, there are a few different types, but for the most part, the traditional classroom setting is general education. Everyone gets the same tier 1 education. So in special education, you may hear the term ICT, integrated co-teaching classroom, where there's one general education teacher and there's one special education teacher. And a lot of schools, they're moving into a more progressive space where they're looking to have general education teachers utilize some of the same strategies and techniques as special education teachers. And to be honest with you, I support it because the left hand should know what the right hand is doing. Not that one is doing more work than the other, but it can be really helpful. And then it gets a little bit more restrictive as we go. But for today's purposes, I'm just going to utilize those 2 classroom settings as an example. So tier 2, that can include small group instruction or additional instruction time. So this can be a smaller subsection of students in the classroom. And for students that have special education services, this could be that ICT model, excuse me, where the special education teacher may work in small groups with the students depending on their classification and their abilities. But that could also mean that the general education teacher is working with another small group. So you see that teachers can do that regardless to whether students have special education services or not. So that's one of the best parts of this, because everybody is getting a little bit extra just to determine what the right fit is. And the data that's extracted from this standpoint can also help if you, as a parent or a provider, want to go down the route of getting special education services, or at least the evaluation. And then tier 3. So of all the 3 tiers, surprise, surprise, this is the one that's a little bit more intensive. It gives more tailored, more scaffolded materials, programs, supports, intervention that is designed to meet your specific child's needs. So if there are things that the teachers are able to identify based on things that they've done in the past, based on how your child is progressing, and they've identified that, okay, we've tried this, maybe we saw a little something, but maybe we can go a step further to see, like, is this gonna gain the outcomes that we need? This is where the tier 3 comes in. Next slide, please. Okay, so the teacher's role. So surprise, surprise, they're key. Like, they're the main ones. They're the head of the show in the classroom. So they're using different methods to screen, to do basic assessments, to get a sense of what your child's skills and behaviors are in the point in time where they are right now. The benefit of this is that that's going to be some of the baseline data. Not all the data. It's not going to inform everything, but it's a good starting point, not just for if we stay in the RTI space, but also if we move into the special education space, because that's going to be the first set of data that is collected as to how your child is currently performing. And then we can do kind of measurements to gauge progress, to gain standstill, or to gain regress, depending on what number of factors is happening based on a specific time frame. And then the additional benefit is that it's going to provide that data that I talked about to determine if your child needs more support than what they are currently receiving in the general education setting. So it's like, okay, they could stay in general education and maybe struggling a little bit, or if they are provided with additional support, then they can be thriving. Then they could be just, living their best life. It's possible. And then based on this, if it is decided that they could benefit from additional support, then we can provide and tailor interventions based on that same data that we collected, so we can target those specific themes and behaviors. And then as an additional step in the process, we're going to monitor the child's progress. We're going to take the data that we got from your youth in the baseline. We're going to take those interventions. We're going to implement them on a regular basis and see what happens. Identify, is this working? Maybe it's not the best intervention. Maybe it works well for another student, but it may not work well for yours. Maybe it needs revision. Maybe we need to tweak it and play with it a little bit, because we were able to identify that there are parts of it that is working and parts of it, they're not hitting so much. And then if it needs to be adjusted, or if we need to throw that whole intervention away and try another intervention to see if that's a better fit. Next slide, please. Okay, so we did RTI. Then what? So if RTI has been provided, and then it's been determined based on the teachers and the service providers that the kid still needs some additional level of support, you or a representative from your child's school, DOE, and for those of you that are not in New York City public schools, the district that you're in whatever county in New York, can make a referral for evaluation for special education. You can also request Section 504, as affectionately known as 504 in school, so a Section 504 accommodation. So that's another intervention that students have access to provide specific accommodations based on the needs that they're identifying or that have been identified, so that they can receive another layer of support. Next slide, please. So, brief breakdown on 504. Sometimes it's a little bit more appropriate than the special education services. So it is tailored to these two specific bullets, but this is part of the Rehabilitation Act. So way back, 1973, but maybe before some of us were born, at least before I was born. But it does require public schools to provide accommodations for any students who are eligible, so that they are effectively able to participate in school activities with anybody else. Anybody. Now, I know it says non-disabled peers, that is the language, but I say anybody. Anybody in the school. Anybody at all. Inclusion. Okay. So this applies to students that may have physical or mental impairments that may impact their activities in life, may impact their ability to engage in peer-appropriate, developmentally appropriate activities. And it can also include access to medication during school, to be administered by a nurse. So for those of y'all that don't know, teachers can't be giving out medicine and nobody else in the school can. Just the nurse, with proper documentation that comes from the physician. So maybe students who have diabetes, maybe students who have ADHD, and need to take medication in the middle of the day, the end of the school day, and it needs to be administered in a particular way. So that is also something that falls underneath 504. And then if they need to be an accessible school building, maybe they have some hardware, maybe they have some tech that needs to be serviced or accessed in a specific way. So we need to make sure that the school that they are attending has the ability to facilitate those services. They should not be in a place or a space where they can't access what they need to maintain that equity that we were talking about before, so that they can get what they need to be successful. Next slide, please. Okay, so how to make a referral? Got to be in writing. Now, one of the ways that we can do this, and this is something that I have done, I've literally sat with parents and I've written out the letter and I've just had them printed it, had them sign it. I have a template depending on what is happening, because if we're getting to the point where we're interested in making a referral, we've collected some data, because if we in a K-5 school, as y'all already know from earlier on, we've already done the RTI process. If we are anywhere from 6 to 12, even though RTI isn't something that exists in that same way, it's a little bit more informal, there most likely is data that is collected to support in the referral process. So you're going to want to get the parent to write it down. Now, there are those of you that may be like me and also have the template, and then you just fill in the specific information. Sometimes parents, you tell them what to write and they'll send an email from their email address that is confirmed, and that can be forwarded on. If you are in, or your youth or child are in a DOE school, that can go directly to either their AP of special education, their special education coordinator, their IEP coordinator, whoever in the building that does the SPED services. But it can also be given to the teacher, so the teacher can give it to the proper party. Now, another way that you can also do this is if you go to whatever the district office is where you live. So for example, where I live in the Bronx is Fordham Plaza. So I have told parents, okay, you're going to go into Fordham Plaza. You're going to explain that you want to make a referral for special education services. Here's my letter. They will take it, they will stamp it, and they will scan it into good old CSIS. Ask me what CSIS stands for. I still don't remember, but it houses all of the special education information for students in New York City public schools. The benefit of that is once it's time stamped within the district offices, they have a specific amount of time in which to initiate. Now, I'm not saying that you got to go down there or tell people to go, but if there has been any inkling that maybe special education services may be a little lax in the building, or you feel like that's not the case, and you're not necessarily sure that you're getting the information you need, this can be a good way to do it. And this is something that I highly, highly recommend for folks that are working in charter schools. And not to say that charter school staff aren't doing their due diligence, but in my experience supervising folks that have worked in charter schools and also working in charter schools, the timeline at times isn't held to the same standard, because sometimes it doesn't get initiated right away. So this is another way that you can support parents with kind of being as proactive as possible, if it is feasible, because it may not be feasible for somebody to take off work and go down there. So there may be other methods in which you want to communicate. So in that template, if you want to create it, or if you want to have bullet points to share with the parent about what they should be including in the letter, it should have the following: a description with as much example as you can, because you know what? We need to get them receipts ready, of the concerns about your child's development, their learning and or behavior, like what's going on in the classroom, even what's going on at home. All of these things can speak to something. Then you're going to formally request a special education evaluation. We want to be really clear about what it is that we're looking for. The list of services that your child has received before, or if they received that RTI, what interventions and things were put into place at that time, or are they currently receiving these things in the classroom, maybe even in the community, because at times community-based providers are also doing work with students who can also demonstrate and provide information, provided they sign a release with the parent, can also be a part of the packet. Then you're going to identify your child's full legal name and date of birth, because we need the demographic information to know who we're dealing with. And then you're going to want to identify who you are as the legal guardian. So your name, address, contact information. I always suggest a phone number and an email. If, you know, some situation may be taking place where you may be in between contact methods, identify an alternate number of a person that will let you know that you are being reached out to, because one of the biggest struggles with initiating this process is that there can be a wait time. So you don't want to feel like you're missing a phone call and setting the process back. and then your preferred language, if not English. And this is fine because they are translation and interpretation services available for pretty much any and every language that there is. It just needs to be in writing that that is something that you need, because God forbid they start the process and everything's in English and you don't speak English. That is going to be really challenging. And then we're going to have to go back to the drawing board to get the language situated. Next slide. Okay, consent. Consent, consent, consent. Like, as we know, consent falls into a lot of places. But you're basically going to be asked, or the parent is going to be asked to sign a consent for initial evaluation. So you're basically identifying in your preferred language or your home language, if it is not English, that you are consenting for your child to sit for an initial evaluation for special education services. And you have to give consent or they cannot do it. There's point blank, period. Sometimes people feel some type of way about this for a variety of different reasons. They share with somebody, it's like, oh no, don't do that, or what does that mean? And it can kick up feelings for people. But unfortunately, if you do not sign consent for your child or your youth to be able to participate, they're not going to be able to move forward and the kid won't get the evaluation. So after you give consent, they have 60 calendar days to evaluate. So they got to make it happen within those 2 months. Yeah, 62. Yeah, I'm doing that mental math. I don't know, brain, you know. So that is really important to get. And then the benefit of that too is that when you sign that, you have a legal document, you have a receipt about the fact that you gave permission for this to happen, just in case something goes however many ways it can go. Next slide, please. Okay, so where you're going to send the referral matters depending on where your kid goes to school and their current age. And there are specific reasons for that. So if you have a preschool age child, they're going to, you or the parent or provider, depending on who is paying attention, will be sending that referral letter that we mentioned previously to the Committee on Preschool Education. So it's very specific because we want to make sure that it's going exactly where it needs to be so it doesn't hold up the process. If your child is kindergarten or above, and they go to an NYC public school, DOE school, then you can do the school principal. Many times they'll handle that, or they may call in the AP of special education, IEP or special education coordinator to take that over. Or you can always give it to your child's teacher because you probably had a conversation about the fact that this is something you wanted done. So that initiates the process in public schools. If you go to a private school, a religious affiliated school, a charter school, or maybe you started doing some homeschooling or they're not enrolled in school as of yet, then you're going to your local district committee on special education, so CSE. If you're like, yo, I don't even know what that is, you can Google districts. You can Google your school district if you're not sure what your school district is, and it'll tell you where your district office is. So for example, I was in District 10. I mentioned Fordham Plaza. If anybody from District 10, which is a pretty large district in the Bronx, they will go to Fordham Plaza for their Committee on Special Education. District 7 is elsewhere. District 9 is elsewhere. So you're going to want to know where the office is located to go to your district if you fall in underneath that criteria. Next slide, please. Okay, if you outside of New York City, so we're not talking about the boroughs, Westchester, Orange, Dutchess, further up than that, you're going to want to contact the school district where your child is located. Sometimes districts are based on towns or counties. So you're going to want to identify, and this is something that school staff can help you with, who and where do I go to give this in the district? Am I asking for somewhere specific? They will work with you to develop a program. They will work with you to develop the evaluation services, the scaffolds necessary, and they will provide recommended services. So it may look a little bit different than it does look here in the boroughs, but the outline is the same. The configuration looks a little bit different. I do have some experience with how it works in Orange County, so like that's something I could speak to, but it could look different in Dutchess and Westchester, for example. But you're always going to want to make sure that you identify where is like the main office for the district that your child attends school. Next slide. Okay, so your referral's in. Great. Now what? we have to follow a couple of extra steps to kind of get the process moving as we expect, or just so that we know what next steps look like. So if we're in the preschool stage, so you submitted your referral to the CPSE, you're going to receive a notice that your referral was received. So that's basically your receipt that they got your request and they're going to get started working on it. Then you're going to be provided with a list of evaluation sites. So these are sites that have been vetted by New York City Public Schools. They are, possibly private providers that have contracted with DOE to provide these evaluations. That way you can, call, engage about appointment times, what's necessary, things of that nature, to kind of get the process starting, and they can explain to you what to expect and what the steps are. And then you're going to get a consent for the initial evaluation. It's a form that basically identifies that consent has been provided, because the evaluation site is going to need to know that that's something that you gave. And then you're going to get information about all the rights that you are entitled to as the parent. And you're going to get information about all the rights of what your child is entitled to. And you're also going to get a medical form, because we also want to make sure that there aren't any medical conditions, or maybe verify that there are some medical conditions that may be playing a role in what is manifesting with your child. If your child is school age, already enrolled in school, you're going to be sent a notice of referral letter. So that's basically just identifying what your rights are for this process. And it also gives you a contact person. So if you're just like, all right, I got to this point, this was overwhelming, I don't know what to do, or you wake up in the middle of the night and you're like, I have this question, I don't know who to ask. It's going to give you the name of a contact person that you can pretty much ask any and everything to. And then it's going to ask you to meet with one of our people, the school social worker, for a social history interview. So there are social workers that are designated just to do this process. And they're going to ask you a whole lot of questions, but the purpose of that is not to be intrusive and to get in your business, but to get the best, clearest picture of your child. And that interview is going to be held in your preferred language and in your preferred mode of communication, because we want to make sure that you are feeling the most comfortable to speak in a language that makes sense for you. And if that means it requires interpretation, we got that, because that's part of the reason that on the referral, we identified the language, so we could also make sure that there's continuity of care and consistency in communication. Next slide, please. Okay, so the initial evaluation includes several different things. So a social history, so that's basically a fancy term for like an interview where you get the opportunity to kind of go down the list from beginning to end about your child's developmental history, milestones, and things that are happening based on what you have been shared with like classroom teachers, and also family history, things that may be contributing or information that may be helpful to know in this process. Then there's a psychoeducational test, which basically is assessing what your youth or your child knows, like what have they learned. And it's not necessarily a pass-fail test. It's more like an assessment, because it's trying to get a sense of like, where are they in this present moment when they're being tested? Then there's an observation where, and it could be any number of people that get designated, because there's a few, they will observe your child in their classroom. So they'll want to get a sense of what they look like in their natural habitat, their natural classroom habitat, just so that they're able to gauge, like, how are they functioning in this current space? Physical exam, so like similar to the document you get for the CPSE, we want to make sure that like all of those basic caveats are met. Because sometimes, like I mentioned to you before, I didn't know I needed glasses in third grade. I thought that's just how things looked. Someone else figured it out until my mom and we went. So we're going to check for vision. We're going to check for hearing, general health. Children are supposed to have at minimum a well-child visit every year. Maybe the family didn't have health insurance, so maybe it's not something that came to mind. So these are all things that we can kind of get the ball rolling on to get that information. And then if you have trouble getting any of these things, maybe, again, we don't have insurance, there's a lack of access, then any member of the IEP team, Your CSC, that same contact that you could call with questions, can help you to point you in the right direction or assist with making an appointment so that you can get these services done with at no cost to you. And then some other assessments that can be identified depending on how your youth or child is presenting when needed, because we're not going to do all of these if we don't need it, are assessments for speech and language, assessment for sign language fluency, occupational or physical therapy, functional behavior assessments, also known as FBAs, assistive technology, so tech that can assist in a variety of different ways, school records, teacher assessments that may have actually been done prior to this that can, add to the packet, and then additional interviews to determine work skills and interests. And this happens when the children are 12 or older. And a lot of this is kind of like that pre-vocational type skill sets, because we also want to get a sense of what their interests are. And because they're 12 or older, they're at a point where hopefully they're able to communicate or have a sense of what they are, or at the very least what they aren't, because they'll tell you quick, fast what they don't like and why. Next slide, please. Okay, so independent assessments. So there are times where families may want to consider independent assessment. So the thing that makes it independent is not done by someone that works for the DOE. Like, it's completely outside, not just like the list that they give you, but somebody who does assessments that's not necessarily linked. So in an independent assessment, one of them is paid for by you, and that could be out of pocket. That could be utilizing your health insurance or other resources that you have available for evaluations. And the thing to know about this is that under all circumstances, the DOE will evaluate children. There are reasons that sometimes family members do not want to go through the DOE. Sometimes they want someone who has a certain level of experience, someone who may specialize in working with Black and Brown communities, someone who has experience prior working with the DOE, so they know the ins and outs, loopholes, things of that nature, especially if they had a negative educational experience or this process up to this point has not been ideal, so they just want to distance themselves. I've pretty much heard all of the gamuts. But you have the right as the parent, as the guardian, whomever, to pay for an independent assessment. Just know that part of the struggle is that these assessments can be extremely expensive. These evaluations can be extremely expensive. The results are only given to you when you get an independent assessment, but you can submit those results that are given to you, and they write up their report and all of those things. You can submit that to your IEP team so that they can use that data to further evaluate what the independent assessor came up with to determine what is best for your child. Then there are the independent assessments that are paid for by the DOE. So for example, if you decide to get your child assessed by DOE, you read the report and you're like, nah, this ain't right. Like, this isn't my kid, or like you missed something, we need to run through this. You may request to get an independent assessment that the DOE pays for because you are not feeling comfortable or confident with what they got. Now, I'm going to be honest with you. It is not necessarily easy to get them to pay for it, but there are several individuals who can help with getting this done. I have worked with attorneys, advocates, and other organizations that have gotten this done on multiple occasions. So it's not impossible. It is possible, but you may need some support. But who doesn't need some support sometimes, one time or another? So in order for you to get this independent assessment paid for the DOE after they did their assessment and you really weren't feeling it, you have to make this request in writing and provide it to the IEP team, the CSC, if your child is preschool age. I'm sorry, the CSC, if let's say you're in a charter school, religious or private, or CPSE, if your child is in preschool. And then they will either agree to pay for the independent assessment or begin an impartial hearing. So impartial hearing, you are going to go and be seen impartially, and then they're going to determine yay or nay, because they can decide that they're not going to pay for they're not going to pay for an assessment, and you want to continue to fight it. The impartial hearing is the way that you do that. Next slide, please. Bilingual assessments. So if you have that child that they speak Spanish at home or French or Farsi. I really like how Farsi sounds. That's why I keep saying it, just so you know. A bilingual assessment is done both in English and your child's home language. The benefit of that is we can compare and contrast. And it's if your home language, you already accustomed speaking it, so things will flow out naturally. So with preschool age children, the languages are identified by the agency and the evaluation site that's listed in the packet. So all of that comes from the information that the parent generates in the initial process. So you'd contact your CPSC. I cannot remember at this moment what ECDC stands for, and I apologize. You can definitely Google that within the scope of special education, and they will assist with finding an agency that does bilingual assessments. There are listings for them, but sometimes they do change. So the fact that you have that contact person that is on the IEP team that is assisting you will allow you to, or will rather better support you to find and identify who can complete the assessment bilingually. So for school age children, they're going to give the assessment based on a couple of things. So the language that you use in home is identified on the home language survey or identification survey, as it's normally known as. Work in school so long, I just, chunk things together. But on the home language survey, it identifies the language that students speak at home. This is also the way that the on-roads or onboarding, if you will, for students who receive ELL services, because if they speak a language different than English at home, then this is one of the ways that they qualify for that, because the survey has been provided to the family and they were able to identify that they speak a language other than English. In addition, the NICETEL, which is the acronym that is in the parentheses, because full disclosure, I didn't remember exactly what it was. New York State Identification Test for English Language Learners. We use a lot of acronyms, y'all. You already know. Or the New York State English as a Second Language Achievement Test, NICE-SLAT. Those are tests that are given annually, if I remember correctly, and the results of that will identify where your youth is in terms of their language proficiency. And these are things that can be really helpful when you're obtaining bilingual assessments, because it is an added data source. Next slide. Okay, so a DOE bilingual evaluator will be assigned based on what we learned from the previous slide. And then if one isn't available for whatever reason, there are other options that will be utilized. So it's like, okay, we can get another evaluator that works for an agency that is under a contract with the DOE to provide these services, because for whatever reason, they may not be available in your district. Or we're going to identify a monolingual evaluator with a spoken language or sign language interpreter. So we're going to identify that we're going to get somebody that is specifically there to interpret what information is coming out to make sure that we get the most accurate picture. Or we're just going to get a non-DOE independent bilingual evaluator. So we're just going to get somebody that has the skills and abilities to do this, that is bilingual, so that we can get the most appropriate evaluation for your youth or child. Next slide. Okay, so the IEP meeting. So at this point, if we at IEP meeting, your evaluation is basically complete. So we're going to identify what kind of comes next. So at the meeting, there's a whole team of people, and the parent is a member. So if you are a service provider, you very well may go with the parent, advocate, things of that nature. And there may be other stakeholders from the school that are there as well, whether it's a special education teacher, child study team, things of that nature. So all of the information from the evaluation that was completed on the child will be reviewed, and then it's going to determine if your child is eligible for special education services based on the results and recommendations in the evaluation. So at this point, if it is determined that your child is eligible for special education services, the team will work together to develop an IEP. So I don't think I mentioned this here, but IEP stands for Individualized Education Plan. And one of the things that I always try to explain to people about this is it does not matter what happens on the IEP, because all it is a document that says how you best learn, how we can best support you. Students who are gifted and talented have IEPs. Students that have disabilities have IEPs. It is just something that anchors how you best learn and how we can best support you, all the stakeholders that you're working with. Next slide, please. Okay, so if English isn't your home language, your preferred language, then a request gets made for interpreter in writing at least 72 hours before the meeting. Usually this is on par because we know that throughout this whole process, that wasn't the case, but this is something that providers will definitely have reminders about. But if you're deaf or hard of hearing, you can have a sign language interpreter during an IEP meeting as well. Usually, there is a team within the DOE that has that. It's just something similarly that needs to be requested so they can participate. Next slide, please. Okay, so the meeting location is determined by a couple of different factors, your child's age or grade level, and the type of school that your child attends. So similarly to some of the other things we've already discussed, preschool age students, it's going to be at the CPSC or the child's school if possible. We want to try to make it in the environment that is already familiar, that they already know, that the parent already knows. School age students, it will be at your child's school. And this is regardless to whether you are in a DOE NYC public school. If you are in a charter school, it's still going to be at the school. The only difference, excuse me, the only difference is that with charter schools, private schools, religious schools, or if you're not enrolled, is that it could also be at the district office at the CSC. Especially if you're not enrolled, that's not going to be the case. But there are times, depending on a few different factors, where they may send a representative to the school, or they may participate via phone, or things of that nature, because the goal is to always not always, but the goal is to try to always have it in the child's school. So that's something that has been an increase over the last several years that they have tried to do, which personally I appreciate. Next slide. Okay, so preparing for the meeting, we're going to discuss all those things that we talked about already. So those questions that you asked, be prepared to discuss them, to bring them up, to come out points, things that impact their academic, their social, emotional, or physical development. And that could be health, mental health, environmental, social determinants of health. All of these are things that, play a role in the development. And then there are ask and share guides. I do encourage that people do Google this. These are things that I have handy and I have shared with parents because I want them to have the time to kind of like organize their resources and things that will help them best communicate. Or if they're struggling with that, then we can kind of collaborate on what are some ways that we can engage in those processes. And also we're going to want to invite additional stakeholders, people that know your child and can help with making decisions that make sense. Now, it may not always be realistic for doctors, child care providers, other relatives, or advocates to always be present, but sometimes we can also utilize the joys of technology and, utilize a virtual space similar to one we're on right now to invite them even in for a few minutes to give the input. And then if we want a certified parent member or parent advocate to attend, we can also make that request in writing, and that individual will show up to be an additional support to the parent for the purposes of the meeting. Next slide, please. Okay, so members of the IEP team, this isn't an exhaustive list, but this is like the basic bare bones list of folks that would be there. So the parent or anyone in a parental relationship with the child, the general education teacher for the student, hopefully they're enrolled in school. If they're not, then that's going to look a little bit different. If your child is currently in general education, that will be the case. If your child has a special education teacher, or because of the RTI process, this was a person that was working with them, or granted, we're talking about an initial, but in a reeval, the special education teacher that's working with your student will be there. And then if there are any related service providers. So if your child is getting counseling, speech, OT, so all of those applicable assessments that we mentioned in the past, if they're getting assessed for any of those things, it's a good possibility that these may be service providers that want to play a role in that, or if they're already working with the child based on the RTI process or based on other interventions that have been put in place before we got here, they may also be able to speak to these themes, and that would be helpful. So a school psychologist, if the meeting is an initial, so the first one, or a reevaluation. So we're reevaluating, we're asking for additional testing, things of that nature for students in K-12. So that runs the gamut. And then a school social worker. if they are involved in the evaluation process for K to 12. So if it was the school social worker that did the social history with the parent, that is most likely the social worker that will be at the IEP meeting. Next slide. Okay. So I don't know why I thought that was okay. Sorry. So a district rep, so that could be the CPSE administrator or designee for preschool children, sometimes a school physician. I will acknowledge that in my probably 10 years of working with schools, I haven't seen a school physician, but that doesn't mean it doesn't happen. And that could be for a variety of different reasons. Also a certified IEP parent member. That's not something that I've seen, but I have heard of it. But again, like mentioned before, that needs to be requested in writing 3 days before. For preschool kids, early intervention service coordinator, usually preschool folks, they have been receiving EI services, so that person can definitely speak and be a support in the meeting. And then if appropriate, and if in the developmental space and age range, students should be allowed to participate in IEP meetings roughly about high school. When I worked in a middle school, if the child was, or youth, was in a place or space to kind of understand the process and understand what an IEP is and why that is important, they were also involved in the meeting because they're at a place where they can begin to understand and advocate for themselves and their needs so that we don't need to make all the assumptions and include them in the planning process, which is paramount because we want to make this a collaborative space and increase the buy-in. Next slide, please. Okay, your role, you, the parent, and if you're a service provider engaging with the parent, their role, are a legally mandated member of the IEP team. The meeting ain't gonna happen without the parent. Sometimes it does, but that's a conversation for another day. So you know your child best. You are your child's first teacher, so you can speak about their skills, strengths, abilities, areas in need of improvement, goals, hopes, dreams. So you can offer observations about what you see, about what they're learning, what they're struggling with, what they're interested in their free time, what their passions are. Talk about things that they use, skills that they have, things that they picked up in different places, how they process information, what they're struggling with. And then you can also take what other items that the team has to offer and contrast because you may be learning something different or something in addition to what you already know about your child because they get to see them in a different setting. And then you can also share your suggestions or offer feedback based on what it is that you're hearing. And then you can ask questions because similarly to some of the acronyms and things that we tend to use in our workplaces, we forget that not everyone comes from the same space and it's not intentional. So I always encourage parents, like if they didn't clarify what an acronym meant or give an explanation, ask. Be like, oh, I don't understand what you just said, or can you run that back, or any other type of vernacular that makes sense for you. And then working with the rest of the team to develop the IEP because as a parent, you have a say. You have the say. Next slide, please. Okay, so sometimes there are issues, but there is a way for us to resolve that. So if you ever feel like there is something going on, you're not really sure, there's a clear, definitive issue, there's something that you think might be an issue and you want to get ahead of it, you can request another IEP meeting. Parents can request an IEP meeting at any time, similar to the initial process. You're going to write a letter requesting an IEP meeting. So on occasion, if the IEP team and you as the parent or the provider that's working with the parent doesn't come to an agreement and identify, all right, so this issue is not resolved or we're kind of talking in circles and there's no progress being made, there are additional options that you can identify, whether mediation or an impartial hearing, and then a third party will come in and support with identifying what the root cause is and coming to a resolution. Next slide, please. Okay, so like I mentioned briefly before, the IEP is a written statement. So it's basically a plan that provides your child with the best access to their free and appropriate public education, FAPE. and in the least restrictive setting, because we don't want to make things so restrictive that they hate school, they hate learning. So you want to give them what they need in a place where it's not feeling like this is too much. So if you feel like you want to have any of the documents, which for the most part are offered, but sometimes it is helpful to remind, you want to have an interpreter at the meeting, like a live person. If you want all of the documents and the things that are related in your home language, if you want those same assessments or notices or reminders, all of that can be in your home language. They just need to be requested. Next slide, please. So a least restrictive environment, a more clear definition, your child will be in schools or classrooms with non-disabled peers for as much as a day as appropriate and as possible. So when we talk about inclusion, we want to make sure that everybody is included. And then part of the reason for that, as you see in the bullet points, is that more time with non-disabled, not in love with the term, but that is the terminology that is utilized currently. But the more time spent with in inclusive spaces, which is the term I like to use, has these outcomes: higher scores on math and reading tests, fewer absences from school, fewer referrals for disruptive behavior, and better outcomes in high school. And it's because they are part of the community. We want all children, regardless to what their needs are, to feel like they are members of the community, to feel like they're not isolated, to feel like they have people. So that's why least restrictive is the most important. Next slide, please. So we kind of talked briefly about eligibility, but you know what? Let's review it again. Eligibility for preschool age students, 3 to 5. It breaks down a lot of what I talked about before. I just kind of put it, in that general slide for us to extrapolate. And then eligibility for school age children. So 5 to 21. The reason 21 is there is because that is when they age out. They can sign out. They can stay in school up until the age of 21 for a variety of different reasons. So if your child meets the criteria for one of more of the 13 classifications, because there are several, and then if they they are determined to have a disability that affects their child's performances. So we have a question from Camille. How does OPWDD services play a part within the school and IEP services? So depending on what the diagnosis or classification is, if a parent is engaged or hopefully willing to engage in OPWDD services, depending on what the program is, especially if there are waiver services, there are supports that can come into the school and do some work, or they can do wraparound supports in the community or in the child's home. With respect to IEPs or special education, there is a collaboration there, whether it's through case management or other supports that work in tandem, because sometimes depending on the level of need, or if there's a specialized placement, or in situations where parents may have to sue the DOE because they need to get additional services or placements that's not accessible, especially once the IEP is created, OPWDD can come in clutch for that. I have worked with them on several different situations, especially students who have autism, because even though there are services that are available for students with autism within the DOE, sometimes providers are a bit scant. So ABA and other themes of that nature have been placed into the school from OPWDD, plus other rehabilitation, waiver support, respite services. I've seen them actually done in schools and even in traditional school settings, not just specialized school settings. So that is definitely an excellent resource to have, especially if students qualify. And sometimes the school counselors or school social workers, depending on what they're seeing, regardless to whether children have the special education services in place, or they're in progress, or they feel like it can be an added benefit to the family structure overall, that is a referral that we can assist with making as well. Hope that answers your question. Next slide, please. Okay, so disability classifications. So there's like 13 of them joints, and it may feel overwhelming, but it can be really important to kind of know what they are. So the typical ones that I see are learning disability, speech language impairment, autism, emotional disturbance. Dyslexia was added a few years ago, but I still have not seen an IEP that has dyslexia on it. But that's just a handful. Oh, and did I mention other health impairment? That's another one that pops up. But again, there are 13. I only named a few. So this is something that can also be helpful to do your homework on and just kind of get a sense of like what's in there. Next slide. Okay, so the contents of an IEP. So the screenshot here is just what the cover page of it looks like if you've never seen one. So it pretty much is a very detailed, or at least it should be, a very detailed document that identifies the strengths, needs, and how we're going to implement that over the course of the school year. So this is annual, gets a new one every year for a variety of different reasons. And what are the supports and services that best suit your youth? What are the things that they need to best help them succeed? And that it allows it allows in space and information for how your child is going to access these services, how they're going to participate, and then how are we gauging the progress in the general education curriculum? Because even though it is a general education curriculum, it is scaffolded by the special education teacher utilizing a different supports and resources to make sure that it is accessible. So a lot of this is accessibility. And I just like saying accessibility. So, but it is important to identify that we can modify anything. Many of us here in this space are social workers, and we need to modify different interventions based on where the developmental intellectual needs are, maybe where you are in the time of day, where your diagnosis is kicking up. It's very similar. Next slide, please. So the IEP contents, present level of performance, where are they right now? Right now. Measurable annual goals. So those goals are created by the individuals that they work with. So all of the core content subject areas and goals are also created for whatever related services they have. So like I was a social worker in a school, so I wrote counseling goals. And then progress reports. When will you receive updates about your child's progress? Because you do get those over the course of the year, depending on how they're broken down or depending on when progress is monitored. I've worked in schools where they've gotten progress reports in tandem with the report card. Some have gotten them monthly. It all depends on a couple of different things, and that will be clearly outlined in the IEP. So if you don't get it, ask. Next slide, please. Okay, so additional major sections. So recommended special education programs and services. So these are all of the things that based on the evaluation that was received and the recommendations that your child is required to have in order to access, participate, and progress in the general education curriculum. So they're outlined. So if that means that they need to be in an ICT, integrated co-teaching classroom, 5 days a week, that is listed on the IEP. If that means that they get counseling, individual, once a week for 30 minutes, and group counseling once a week for 30 minutes, that's in there too. It identifies specifically what services and programs that they're getting to support them. And then it also identifies how they're participating in students without disabilities, how they're being included into that community. That is also listed in there. Because as we know, an IEP is a legal document. So we want to make sure we hold in these schools' feet to the fire to make sure that students are getting everything they need, because that's why it's listed on the IEP. And also how they're going to participate in state or district-wide assessments. So if they will participate, because there are some students who don't participate in state testing, and there are some that do. Sometimes there's alternative assessment and what that looks like. All of that is identified in the IEP. Next slide, please. So consenting to services. So I know we already talked about consent, but it's important, so we always come back to it. So after it's developed, they're going to ask for your written permission, or as a provider, they're going to ask for your client, your parents' written permission to begin starting services. That's something that you have to consent to. So every step of the process, you have to provide your okay as a parent about what comes next. So no services are going to be arranged or provided unless the consent is signed. So some people might feel some type of way because it's like, oh, but like we had the meeting, I haven't heard nothing about services started, we haven't received your consent. There could be a variety of reasons why, but that hasn't come to fruition just yet. So we need to make sure that happens. But the same way that we give consent for services, we can also withdraw that consent. And that is also something that has to be written, but you have the right to change your mind. So if you decide that whether a year passes or 5 years pass or 10 years pass, that you're like, you know what? I think it might be beneficial to try this out again. You can have your child evaluated for services again. You're just going to have to start the process all over and write that new letter, give it to the school or CSE or, well, not CPSE if it's so many times has passed, but you're going to have to give in the letter the same way that you did it the first time with the initial referral. And then you can always request a reevaluation because you want to get a sense of, okay, have we made some progress? Where are we at? And you can request that for school staff, or you can also, excuse me, or you can also go to that district office that I talked about or the CSE. But it does take place once a year, but it doesn't take place more than once a year. So like if let's say 6 months have passed and you want a reevaluation, you have to write in for it. But if you don't, then at least at the very least every year you will get an annual meeting. Next slide. So as we mentioned before, sometimes there are issues. There's conflict that comes up and everybody is not on the same page. So same thing. Now that we have the actual IEP, we can request another meeting to kind of bring that forward. And then again, same way like we would have done it before, based on what the contents of the evaluation had or the assessment had, we can seek additional support through mediation or impartial hearing where a third party will come in, review documents, get testimony and things of or accounts, because it's not always testimony, get accounts and kind of figure out what the next best step is and make a decision at that level.